Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Groom. It's time to work on your APES curriculum notebook. So go ahead and get your notebook out and let's turn to the table of contents. If you look at the table of contents, you'll see that we're covering 1.11, food chains and food webs, which will be on page 22 and 23. So go ahead and turn to those pages. In this lesson, you will learn about food chains and food webs. The learning target is describe food chains and food webs and their constituent members by trophic levels. You will learn that food webs show interconnected food chains and that food webs demonstrate feedback loops if any changes occur to members. All right, so on page 23, this is what you'll be writing down on page 23. We'll start with food chains. You've been learning about food chains for a long time. Food chains show specific transfer of energy from one organism to another. So it's about the movement of energy from a producer to a primary consumer to a secondary consumer. So one food chain shows one specific chain of trophic feeding. Food webs are more accurate because they show the complex ecosystem interactions. There is never just one food chain. So food webs are much more realistic. It's a model of interlocking pattern of food chains. So you see this food chain mixed with this food chain, and they're all interlocking, interacting. And it's going to show the flow of energy and nutrients in two or more food chains. So that's what makes an actual food web. Feedback loops. We talked about feedback loops from chapter 2. We learned that there are negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. And feedback loops, the point is for the ecosystem to deal with some kind of change. It's either going to resist the change or it's going to amplify the change. So in a food chain or food web, when one species is removed or added to a food web because of any number of reasons, could be human impact, it could be that the habitat has been destroyed, whatever the case may be. The rest of the food web can be affected and usually will be affected. And so the food web kind of takes care of itself by making the changes it needs to make. It also shows you that any change in any part of a food web can have effects on the entire food web. Okay, so go ahead and turn to page 22. You're going to cut out the 4 half pages on food webs and food chains that belong on page 22, and then you're going to tape them on this page in layers, and then follow the directions to complete the activities. So I will go ahead and show you how to tape those half pages onto page 22, and then we'll go through the activities together. Let's go ahead and work on the first sheet. And if you'll notice, it's asking to identify organisms as either producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, etc., or decomposers. Some organisms may occupy more than one level, and if so, use their lowest classification. So I'm using my same colors that I've been using throughout all of the videos. Anything that does photosynthesis would be considered a producer. So we have algae, reeds, and water plant as photosynthesizers or producers. Then moving on to primary consumers, anything that eats a producer is considered a primary consumer. So the water boatman, the mosquito, and the snail are considered primary consumers. Secondary consumers, we have the small fish, and there are more, and then a tertiary consumer, we have the diving beetle. So take a minute to pause and to finish filling out this worksheet, and then I will show you what I got as my answers. Here are the answers to sheet 1 on the food web. You can see the producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and even goes all the way up to quaternary consumers. And then we have a few decomposers. So make sure that your food web looks like this. So then on the next sheet, you're going to actually draw out the food web using the information from the sheet before. So you need to start at the top, so putting the producers at the top, and then working your way up the food chain, up the food webs, to decomposers at the very bottom. So for sure we would start off with one of the producers we know is algae. We also know that there are reeds and the water plant. Okay, then our primary consumers, we have the water boatman, the mosquito, and the snail. Secondary, turtle, small fish, swan, and then tertiary, we have frog. So you see how I'm kind of putting them in their levels? So we've got producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and then our final level we have quaternary consumers. So we have a pelican, and then at the very bottom we have decomposers. So we have the crayfish and the worm. So this is the setup for the food web where we put our producers and consumers in the correct spot. Now what you have to do is to draw arrows to connect them. The arrows show the direction of energy transfer. So we know automatically because of the information that mosquitoes eat algae. So the energy starts in the algae and will move to the mosquito. The water boatman eats the algae, the reeds, and it actually eats the mosquito as well. So remember that the arrow is showing the movement of energy, not that this is eating that, but it's showing that the energy from the algae is moving up here. So what I'm going to do is you can pause the video and you need to go ahead and finish filling this in. It's going to be pretty crazy, and then you can use your colors to identify each. All of my producers are going to be green, so you can just simply put a box around them. Primary consumers, and so on. Okay, so pause the video and go ahead and finish completing this food web. Okay, so here is the food web that I drew out. It looks crazy, it looks like a mess, and that's the way it should be. So I just started with one organism, and then I drew arrows to what it would eat. So you can see if I look at the swan, that the swan eats the snail. So the energy from the snail goes to the swan. The snail eats the water plant. So the energy from the water plant goes to the snail. And that's pretty much it for that one. But you can see that there's a lot of crazy arrows here because there's a lot of things that eat more than one thing. And so it gets really crazy. So check yours and see how you did. Make sure that your arrows are going from what's being eaten into what is eating, so that it's showing the movement of energy. Okay, next you're going to draw a food pyramid. So it's already been drawn for us, and we know that we're going to have several different levels. So we're going to have at least 5 levels. And so then what this wants us to do is to list out the organisms and just write their names within the correct level. Okay, so go ahead, we can go ahead and start. We can put on the bottom, we can put algae. reeds, and the water plant. Alright, so go ahead and pause this video, take a minute to finish filling this in, and then I'll show you what I have. Okay, here's the pyramid that I ended up drawing, and I just literally wrote in the names of the organisms in the correct level that they would be on the food pyramid, with the decomposers written on the outside. Finally, on the last page, you're going to complete these by answering the 4 questions. And so go ahead and take a minute to do that, and then I will show you what I have. Here is the final sheet for page 22, sheet 4. Identify 2 different food chains. I just picked 2 different ones, algae to snail to swan, or reeds to water boatman to turtle. And then 2 through 4 are looking at if something happens to one of the organisms, how is that going to affect other ones? So number 2, if the pelican went extinct, the population of frogs would increase because there are fewer predators, because the pelicans eat the frogs. If the dragonfly goes extinct, then the population of lizards would decrease because they have fewer prey to eat. If the reeds went extinct, the population of water boatmen would also decrease because they have less to eat. Now there are different options of things you could do here, but these are good examples. In this lesson, you learned about food chains and food webs. The learning target was to describe food chains and food webs and their constituent members by trophic levels. You learned that food webs show interconnected food chains, and that goes from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer. You learned about decomposers breaking down dead and decaying material. And then you also learned that food webs demonstrate feedback loops if any changes occur to the members. So there could be a positive feedback loop, there could be negative feedback loops, but the food webs will adapt to the changes that occur. Good job.